welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Pat Brown. We're filming this interview 2 days after President Trump's inauguration, and while that is a tiny fraction of the road ahead, we already have a lot to talk about. Upcoming episodes will get into more detail about the executive orders and other announcements made on Monday, but today, we're taking a first blush look at the flurry of activity that has kicked off the second Trump administration. Joining me to walk through the last 2 days are Nikole Flax and Chairman Dave Camp. Nikole, Chairman Camp, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Okay, so to start off, I've got a question for each of you guys, and maybe Chairman Camp, I'll start with you. I want to get your overall thoughts and maybe any surprises on what came out of the immediate aftermath of the inauguration, and frankly, what topics are coming up in your client conversation?
Well, thanks, Pat. Not really too many surprises because many of these executive orders the president talked about in the campaign, and I think maybe, the fact that so many of them were done all in the first day might be a bit of a change from what other presidents have done. But I think probably one of the surprising things is where he did them in a sports arena, and then some of them, and then threw pens into the crowd and sort of a rally type approach. Normally, executive orders are sort of signed at a desk and sort of released.
Right.
So that was a bit surprising, but I think it shows how he's going to continue to, engage the public as he
Right.
moves forward on these. But yeah, there's certainly many of them, broad scope and depth in terms
Yep.
of the number of executive orders that he issued.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Nikole, how about you? Any immediate thoughts, reactions, surprises?
Well, I'll say one surprise came right before the inauguration. I think from the IRS perspective, folks were assuming that the commissioner was going to stay in place until the incoming nominee was vetted,
Right.
or potentially confirmed.
Right.
And Danny Werfel did announce on Friday that he was stepping down as
Right.
of Monday. And if you saw some of the activity quickly happen, some of the senior officials were asked to step down, and so
Right.
he obviously got in front of anything that could have happened.
Yes. So, Chairman Camp, you talked a lot about executive orders, a lot of executive orders. In fact, as of this filming, more than 200 executive orders have been signed. Maybe at a high level, let's talk about the effect of executive orders generally. How are they implemented? What do they mean? What does an executive order mean?
Well, thanks, Pat. I mean, these are really how the president and the administration manages the executive branch. And so that's what executive orders are. They really are directed to the executive branch. Some are immediate, much like pausing the TikTok ban, which was one of the executive orders, and some will take some time. For example, the president has an anti-inflation order directing agencies and agency heads to deliver emergency price relief. That's going to take some time to do that. Abraham Lincoln issued the most famous executive order. That was the Emancipation Proclamation. And this authority comes under Article 2 of the Constitution, which doesn't specifically mention executive orders, but does say that power is vested in the president for executive action. So these executive orders are not absolute. They can be reviewed in judicial review. And as we've seen already, there have been lawsuits filed on the executive orders that the president has issued so far. And those executive orders can be overturned by courts.
Yep. So 200 executive orders, two of them, that would be 1%, maybe are of keen interest to our audience because they relate to tax policy issues. And of course, one of those executive orders was a broader trade policy, but that talked about tax, but in the context of a broader trade policy executive order. Can you talk a little bit about what was in those? What are your preliminary thoughts about those two executive orders in particular?
Yes, I mean, I'm sort of tax and trade sort of go together on some of these executive orders. He directed agencies to examine whether or not our tax treaties are being adhered to or whether they're being violated, and also said that there might be protective measures that should be taken, and he wants agencies to develop what those would be if our tax treaties are not being followed. And then also on trade, he asks that they examine, what our trade deficit is and what causes that. Also, any unfair trade practices as well as any currency manipulation. So it really these sort of come in the executive order that he calls the America First trade agenda. And these are things that will take some time to develop. But as we've seen, Congress is already sort of reacting to this, and we've seen the legislation that is the Defending American Jobs Act, reintroduced in the Congress by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and that allows for the doubling of taxes, for example, on citizens and corporations of foreign countries.
Right, right. So, Nikole, Chairman Camp talked about executive orders are directions to the executive agencies. One of those, of course, is the IRS. So maybe talk a little bit about some of the kind of downstream ripple effects of some of the executive orders. So we talked about, or we saw, in addition to the things that Chairman Camp talked about, a freeze on regulations. There was also an executive order relating to return to work, return to the office for federal employees. So let's talk a little bit about some of those executive orders, how they affect the agency workforce at the IRS, and what will the effect of those orders mean for the IRS and indeed for taxpayers?
Sure, yeah. So as we talked about, there have been a number of executive orders that apply to government at large.
Yep.
Some of those will hit the IRS in a harsher way than it will impact other agencies. I think with respect to guidance, that's no surprise.
Right.
I mean, that's a customary thing to do, to have a pause. And
Yes.
if you've seen how guidance has been coming out in the last several weeks, there's always a push at the end of administration to try to, to try to get out what they can, recognizing that there will be a pause. So I think that was expected. And I think also it's unrealistic that any agency would be trying to put out something very controversial in the first few weeks before their political positions are filled. But with respect to some of the staffing executive orders, I think they will have a significant impact on the IRS. You asked about telework. There's been a lot of talk around telework and the IRS, and some of it is, I think, a misunderstanding, and some of it is just a change in how the workforce has worked over time.
Right.
When you look at the executive order, it does have a provision at the end that gives the agency some latitude to determine how to best implement it. I think there'll be two major challenges with the telework executive order. It's not as easy as it sounds just to bring everyone into the office. With respect to the IRS, office space is their second largest expense after staffing, and they have been working for years to try to save government resources with respect to office space. And as they've made progress in that area, there are some parts of the country that they wouldn't have the physical space for everyone to come in 5 days a week. Also, the majority of the IRS's workforce is unionized, and there's a collective bargaining agreement.
Okay.
We saw on Monday the union filed a suit with the administration on the Schedule F changes, which are changing the classification with respect to employees. So I think it's fair to assume that the union will continue to push back on some of the telework changes, and that will just have to play out in terms of how it will.
So we've got a day one action, but obviously what comes after that remains open for further discussion. We'll see where it goes. So obviously, anytime we have a new administration, that means new personnel, including new personnel in key positions. I want to ask each of you guys to weigh in on the newly appointed or nominated IRS commissioner, former Missouri Congressman Billy Long. Of course, as we know, Commissioner Werfel handed in his resignation, so he has now left the building. Former Congressman Long has been nominated by the president to fill that role as IRS commissioner. I want to ask each of you guys, maybe starting with you, Nikole, your thoughts about the former congressman, the role he would play, what direction he might take things, how the workforce might react to him.
Yeah, and well, has a different background than I think traditionally the IRS commissioner has had. Traditionally, the IRS commissioner is either a business person or a tax person, and he has a different background. He has had some involvement in the employee retention credit, which has been a big focus for the IRS. So I think there's some speculation asking whether the agency may take a different view with respect to that provision. So we'll wait and see. I think the fact that he has a different background, a lot of people would say, is a welcome change. That that's the whole point, right? Is to have a different perspective. I think traditionally all the IRS commissioners that I've worked with have embraced the workforce and have tried to better the conditions for the workforce. I think one thing that's important to remember, there's a lot of rhetoric around enforcement and pausing hiring. There are more non-enforcement employees at the IRS than enforcement employees. So employees who work on problem solving and service issues and IT. And you could see where there's a lot of opportunity for a change in focus that's still supportive of the IRS workforce, depending on what the perspective is. So I think it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, great. Chairman Camp, from one former congressman to another former congressman, what are your thoughts on Billy Long as for the IRS commissioner?
Well, I did serve with him in Congress, of course, and he wasn't on any of the tax writing committees or really didn't have a background in tax, as Nikole pointed out. But one of the things he does bring to the table is he's very close to President Trump, an early and longtime supporter of President Trump. And I think that is not unhelpful when you're in a government role. And I think what will be important is what is the team that surrounds him? And we've seen some pretty solid people appointed to the IRS and to Treasury that I think could help him. And also there'll be, the existing staff there, and there'll be an acting director. So the question will be, when does he actually take over in terms of his role? Is it one that happens quickly, or this will be delayed even maybe past filing season? I think it will be a challenge, of course, to come into that role during tax filing season, but he hopefully will develop and have a strong team around him.
Right. Thanks, Chairman Camp. So one last quick question to each of you guys. It's been 2 days. We've been hearing a lot. I know you've been hearing a lot. I've been hearing a lot from companies. How are companies dealing with everything that's coming at them? And do you have any quick thoughts or quick advice for companies? Maybe Chairman Camp, I'll start with you, and Nikole, give you the last word.
Well, yeah, it's. I think we're at a point where it's, what really is going to be important. There's going to be a lot of twists and turns as we move through the next few weeks and months, particularly as it regards to tax policy and how that may be framed. I think this is where the relationships that many companies have been building over the last couple of years, anticipating the renewal of the TCJA and significant policies on the legislative agenda, this is where those relationships will really pay off. The other point is there are a lot of new people in Congress, and so there are a lot of opportunities to build and develop relationships. I saw a statistic that 68% of the House has been elected since Donald Trump was first elected. So that's a big opportunity to really get your issues in front of members of Congress. So again, it's going to be engage from now, at least until the TCJA is signed into law again, or the renewal of that bill is signed into law.
Yeah, thanks. Great insight, Chairman Camp. Nikole, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think related to that, on the administrative side, it's more of a temporary exercise in patience. So as the policy changes are effectuated and things are more clear, it will take some time to see how that plays out in the more tactical administrative actions of the government. And I think, especially for companies who have ongoing relationships with the IRS, they still have to, keep working towards that.
Right.
Understanding there could be, more significant changes to come, but those changes take some time.
Yeah. I think what I'm hearing from both of you guys at some level, and the advice that I often give clients that I'm terrible at, which is we have to be patient.
Yeah.
And I'm terrible at it. So it's hard to do, but I want to thank both of you guys for joining us. Really great insights there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we go, it's the beginning of a new year, which means the release of PwC's Tax Policy Outlook. A link to the Outlook is in the description of this episode, along with a registration link for a webcast on the Outlook and what to expect for tax policy in 2025. That webcast takes place tomorrow, January 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Also included in the episode description is a PwC tax policy alert pertaining to Pillar 2. Thank you as always for joining us, and take care.